Hello and welcome to E333. I'm your instructor, Gregory Myers. This video, we're going to take a look at another example in our fundamentals driver. We're going to focus in on our user class, and what we're going to do is we're going to leverage some of our static attributes, and we're going to create a couple of static methods to be able to leverage those static attributes or static variables inside of our user class. So to begin with, what we want to do is we want to take a look at our user.java. This video assumes that you've already built your user class, have already added an array list, and you've already sort of had some exposure then to using the array list, and particularly that you've created these constructors that add the current object to the array list once the constructor is essentially finished running. So basically, you construct the object and then you add it to this class level or static variable users. In this case, it's an array list. It's just a nice collection that we can use. So what we want to accomplish here is we want to do a combination of things. We want to create another static method that essentially will allow for us to loop through all of the users for, in this case, outputting them to a CSV file. And if you see over here on the right, I've created a CSV file, a sample CSV file. My hopes are that we will have the ability to not only export all of the users utilizing our user class and the static method that we're about to create, but then ultimately another video, we're going to take a look at how we would go about importing all of our users. So to begin with, what I want to do is I want to create a new public method, and we can discuss real quick as far as what the input and output arguments should look like. Input arguments, we really shouldn't expect to need any, because the idea is that this public method, this public static method, will just simply use our users to be able to populate then the file. You could argue that, for instance, maybe a valid input argument for this method might be the file that we wish to write the users to. We can always come back and add that later on. For right now, we're going to simply hard code that. We're going to call it users.csv. But the return value then can also be argued somewhat. We, of course, could simply have a void argument return, in other words, basically none, or what we could do is we could also return possibly a string, which would essentially just represent all of the information that we have written to the file, or even possibly an integer and just simply return how many items we wrote to the file. So there's all sorts of different possibilities. What I'm going to do, though, to sort of pull double duty here, is that I'm going to have this particular function also return a string. And it's going to take up a little bit of extra memory. It's going to perhaps be a waste to do this. But what it does get us is the ability to verify very quickly exactly what was written to the file. So what we're going to do here is we're going to have a public static string. And we're simply going to call this particular method then toCSV file. So toCSV file. And for right now, we're not going to accept an input argument. We're simply going to hard code the file name. So this, once again, assumes that you've already watched some of the earlier videos, so I'm not going to spend quite as much time on some of the details about setting up the file IO. I would encourage you to watch this one, watch those videos first. But at the very least, what we want to do is we want to have a java.io.file, and we're just going to call this one output file. We're going to also need to have a java.io.file writer. And we're simply going to call that one output file writer. We are also going to need a temporary variable called index and another string that we're going to refer to as our output. And so that we can get this red to go away, we're simply going to go ahead and return our output. The output is essentially going to be a way of concatenating, if you would, all of the output from each one of our calls to our toCSV function, our instance level functions. So at this point then, what we need to do is we need to set up our try catch. And the purpose for the try catch is, of course, to handle the exception that might be thrown if there are some issues with writing to the file. We're still going to stick with the exception as opposed to a specific IO exception. We're just going to catch anything we possibly can here. So in this case, it's going to be java.lang, java.lang .exception, and we're just simply going to call this one EX. And then inside of here, what we want to do is we want to do two things. We'll simply say the system.out.println, and we're going to simply output whatever that exception has for a string. You can also look at the stack trace and a number of other things. And then arguably what we would want to consider doing is resetting the output to 0, because at this point, or rather the output to an empty string, because at this point we're going to assume that the file was not successfully written. So you can reevaluate this as you need. So consider this. Maybe we don't necessarily overwrite this. One of the advantages of it is maybe you got partially through writing the file and then for whatever reason you threw an exception. It would be nice to look at the output, whatever the partial output was, and it might help you somewhat with your troubleshooting. So I'm going to leave this in here for you to consider about what you want to return in the event of an unexpected error. Now, from here, then what we want to do is we simply want to set the output file equal to the java.io.file when we use the constructor here. And so we want to have a new java.io.file. And once again, in this case, for this example, we are simply going to hard code it. Now, for the file writer for this particular example, we have then a question of whether we want to overwrite the existing file. So short term, we may just simply want to append it, but long term, the idea is that we would simply aggregate all of our users in this users array list, and we would then write all of the users out at once. So ultimately, we want to overwrite any existing file. And that's where then the discussion comes into play about whether we wanted to use that overload. In other words, if we want to add a second toCSV file method that accepts a file name, which essentially becomes a copy function. We'll cover that in a later video. For right now, what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and call the constructor for the output file writer. And this is going to be a new java.io.file writer. And it's going to use the output file that we have specified earlier. And at this point, then, the other thing that you always want to go about doing is simply closing whatever file that you have opened before you forget. And then in here, we simply want to loop through each one of our users. So to do that, we simply build a for loop, and we use our index variable. And so in this case, for index equals to 0, and then we want to continue while the index is in fact less than the user's dot size. Now, if you recall from the earlier video, I had to use the get method, the static get method, the get users method, and that is because the users array list is private. Now, since we are inside the class, in other words, this toCSV file function is inside the same class as the array list users, we don't have to use the get. We can access the users directly. So in this case, we can just say users.size, and then of course we simply increment the users, increment the index. And at this point then, all we want to do is we want to leverage then that output file writer, and we can simply write to it using the overload that accepts a string. And what we want to do now is we can call Try to get this to go away. There we go. What we can do is we can call then the toCSV method for a specific user. And to do that, we simply say users.get, which allows for us to get a specific user using that index. And since our array list knows that it is an array list of type user, we can then specify the toCSV function associated with a specific user. And so hopefully very quickly you can start to see how we can build these fantastic projects very quickly by structuring our classes correctly and providing the appropriate methods. So take a second to pause the video and think about this to make sure that you're comfortable with what's going on here. So essentially what we're doing is we're looping through each one of the users in our users array list, and we're simply leveraging the index to pick out a particular user, and we are calling the toCSV method for that particular instance of that user. Now, it seems probably kind of strange that we're using a static or shared array list to do that, but essentially that array list then is going to leverage or be able to capture all of the users regardless of where they might have been created in your code. Now, at this point then, we should be done. All we need to do is go back to our fundamentals driver and then figure out a way to call this. So what we want to do now is we're going to build a little demo here in our fundamentals driver to call our toCSV file method. So let's go ahead and copy this method real quick. We'll go ahead and save this. We'll come over to our fundamentals driver. And what we want to do now is we want to go down here to the bottom and we'll create one more method here. Let's make sure that we're at the bottom of it here. Make sure that we are outside of the last function. In this case, what we want to do is we'll once again do a public static void as the same as our earlier demos. And in this case, we're going to call this toCSVFileDemo. And it's going to accept no input arguments right now. We'll come back and we'll revisit this later. We may add another input argument at a later time to be able to pass, for instance, the command line arguments. But at this point, what we need to do is if we just call this toCSV file method, it doesn't have any users yet. In other words, we have to create the users or otherwise this file will get overwritten and there won't be any values in it. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to go ahead and declare a couple of users here. So in this case, EE333.user, and in this case, we're going to very unceremoniously call this user A, and EE333 user and user B. Now, ultimately, we can create many, many more users, but the idea is that we want to automate this process. So for this demo, I'm just going to hard code a couple of users here. Specifically, I'm going to use the constructor that allows for me to simply specify all the input arguments at once. And so we're going to say new EE333.user. And in this case, I'm just going to specify G. Myers for the first argument. The second one is going to be Gregory. That's the first name, last name, and then the age. Now, user B is going to be done likewise. So, and in this case, let's make it a little different here. We're going to say last name is J. Jones, or excuse me, the ID is J. Jones with the first name being James, and the second name being Jones, and we're going to make this person 30. And the idea is I wanted to have something a little bit different than what you see in your users.csv file so that you can sort of verify that this is working. Now, at this point then, all we have to do is make a call to our EE333.user.toCSV file function. And what we'd like to do is we'd like to capture whatever results were returned from this operation. So in this case, we also want to go ahead and create maybe a string that we're simply going to call results, and we'll say results are equal to ee333.user.toCSV file. And that is all we're going to need to do in the fundamentals driver.java. Now, if you were following along, you probably are wondering, what will the results be? Well, at this point, we haven't gotten anything, because if you notice here, we declared our output, but we didn't actually do anything to it. In other words, we didn't append anything to it. So basically, we declared it as a set of empty quotes, empty string, and then we didn't actually leverage it. So what we'd like to do now is, inside of this same for loop that we were using to write to the file, we're just going to take a second and we're going to update our output. So we're going to say output plus equal to the users dot get whatever the index is. Basically what we're going to do is we're simply going to copy the code from the previous line. Now, this is why I said earlier that this becomes sort of an expensive operation, and it's perhaps unnecessary. There's a couple of ways that we can improve this, not the least of which is to use a string builder. But in this case, what we're going to do is we're simply going to essentially append onto the output of the toString, or the toCSV for a specific user. You can ultimately decide perhaps what you would like your output to be in the future. Once again, you could argue that you simply want a count of the number of users written to the file. What this gets us, though, is over here in our fundamentals driver.java, you can simply set up an if statement, and you can look at the length of the results to determine whether anything was written. So I tell you what, let's just, rather than set it up as an if statement, how about if we just simply do a system.out.println, and in this case what we'll do is we'll simply just create a nice little string here, results, and then we'll add whatever the length of the results happens to be. So we can see essentially what we have written, or rather how much we've written to the file. At this point, the only thing left to do is to take our function here and essentially turn it into a switch for the console. And we can do that by just simply adding another option in our else if. So else if args.length equal to 1 and args 0 dot equals ignore case, and then whatever our switch happens to be. Now, at some point, we will want to come back and clean up this if statement a little bit. There are definitely some more efficient ways that we can go about doing this. Let's go ahead and paste this right here. And let's make sure, I think I'm missing, there we go, I'm missing a parentheses. All right, but at this point though, we're set up to call our demo. So let's go ahead and build this one last time. Let's come out here to our console. I'm going to clear the screen. In this case, instead of running our file reader demo, what we're going to do is we're going to run our toCSVFileDemo. And there's not a lot of output to the screen because we didn't actually print all of the contents of that results. Instead, we just simply said results 60. That was the length, or the number of characters that were written. And you'll see that, in fact, our users.csv file has been updated. And you know that because if you were paying attention a little earlier in the video, you'll notice that Bob was our first user, and now G. Myers is our first user. So we've updated the file, but more importantly now we have shown how you can use a static method to essentially enumerate the entire collection of the users and write them to a file. Notice how this is encapsulated. This demo right here doesn't know anything about what's going on. It's all being handled inside of this static method that resides in our users class. So hopefully you found this video useful. As always, don't hesitate to email me if you have any questions or comments, and thank you for watching.